What do you get when you mix Skinwalkers and the internet messaging board 4chan? Worse. You get worse. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Line. Back in the early 2010s, I came across something that was referred to online as the Fleshgait. It was a creature with terrifying capabilities. It could mimic the voice of a loved one perfectly, run with superhuman strength and speed, could read your mind even. Of course, it was not real, and the circumstances under which people would see these things were always pretty strange. They'd be off hiking with a group of friends, and someone came back from walking over to take a leak or something like that, and they just seemed off. There was just something wrong about them. Or you'd have a group that were on a camping trip, and they'd think, we left here with 5 people, and there's 6 now. But the problem would be they could not for the life of them figure out which person was wrong, who wasn't supposed to be there. Now, the reason given for why you couldn't figure out which person in your group wasn't supposed to be there was always the same. It was that the Fleshgait can screw with your memories. It can tell you that you remember this person for years back into life, but you don't. That person never existed, or at least not as far as you were aware of them. You see, in many of these stories, the victims do manage to get away unscathed simply by getting out of the wilderness, getting to a road, getting to a small town, something along those lines. But those who don't escape typically end up on the business end of the Fleshgait's claws? And I say claws with a question mark there, because nobody's totally sure what this thing is supposed to look like in its natural form. It can take the human form, it can mimic you perfectly, it can look exactly like a human being. But what does it look like in its usual, just out and about, off for a flesh stroll? What does it look like then? Now, if any of that sounds familiar, be it the mimicry, the shape-shifting, the superhuman strength and speed, the description of being tall, lanky, with long clawed hands and fanged teeth, if any of that sounds familiar to you, that's for good reason. Because the Fleshgait is not Native American folklore, it's not one of the Fae, it's nothing like that. The Fleshgait appeared on the internet and is original to the internet. Sometime in the late 2000s and early 2010s, stories about skinwalkers, and these were not your Native American skinwalker, these were a horror movie version, a special version of this created for the purpose of telling scary stories. But these stories of skinwalkers were starting to depart so heavily from the original skinwalker lore of the Navajo people that it just didn't seem right. People were getting confused, there were constant comments about, well, this isn't a skinwalker, this is something else entirely. So the community, coming together, decided to change the name, and as you can look at the term Fleshgait, you can think skin walk, you can see how these two things are very, very obviously connected. But you'll notice the Fleshgait is not a deliberate work of fiction. It's not that the community got together and said, hey, let's create something new, a new horror monster that we can write our stories about. Instead, this was a natural process. This was a new creature being created out of an amalgam of others. And it wasn't because somebody wanted to write one story, it was because the community, the horror fiction people who are out there writing everything, they wanted something with the powers they had in mind. They didn't want to be working within the framework of somebody else's creation, but they also wanted something recognizable enough to grab your attention off the bat. And these stories often utilize traits or motifs common to the stories of other monsters. Skinwalkers, obviously, but there's also aspects of the Wendigo sprinkled in there, as well as the more nebulous concept of the Goatman. I personally found these stories on iFunny back in 2013, but in 2014, the official subreddit for seeing Fleshgaits, for describing them, for discussing this phenomenon, so to speak, that went up in 2014. Now, as I just said, the Fleshgait did not crawl out of the primeval forests of Eastern Europe, nor did it emerge from the plains of the southwestern United States. This is a creation of the internet. This is a collective piece of fiction. But unlike many such internet folklore topics, this one actually developed naturally. It builds upon older folklore, creating something that previously, in that form, did not exist. In order to properly understand the Fleshgait, what it is, why it is, you need to have a good grasp on those other 3 creatures I mentioned: the Wendigo, the Goatman, and the Skinwalker, and we'll be starting with the Skinwalker. Now, these legends come to us primarily through the Navajo people. But before I get into any details about the Skinwalker, the Wendigo, any of that, it is important to note that the Wendigo and the Skinwalker come from completely different, completely separate groups. The Navajo have the Skinwalker, the Algonquin have the Wendigo. The Algonquin, of course, are native to the eastern United States as well as eastern Canada. And while the actual specific Algonquin tribe, after which the language is named, really only occupies a small area northeast of the Great Lakes, the Algonquin language family spread out across a far greater swath of North America. Most of those lands, however, were often covered in snow and ice in the winter, which leads to the Wendigo having a very specific association with the cold, with winter, and of course with cannibalism. The Wendigo, as a result, is often talked about as a spirit or a creature with a heart made out of ice that thrives in the cold and is created when a hunter, trapper, trader, anybody who lives their life out on the frontier, when that person is forced to consume another human being, be it out of greed or out of desperation, they will become a Wendigo. And this creature varies in description because, again, we're talking about basically a continent-wide legend. There is no one individual Wendigo story, there are just a collection of tales about this one type of creature. One such story says that the Wendigo could be described as gaunt, emaciated, lanky, its finger and toenails missing, its lips frostbitten, the stench of rot and death emanating everywhere it goes, and just with a singular sole desire to feed on human flesh. Now, if we contrast that with the Skinwalker that the Navajo have, we see something pretty different. First of all, we see a totally different landscape. The Navajo inhabit parts of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. This is not the icy snowscape of northern Canada. Additionally, while the Algonquin have lived in eastern Canada and the eastern US essentially as long as anybody is aware of, the Navajo were new arrivals to their new homeland back in like 13 or 1400 AD. They haven't been there all that much longer than the European settlers. You see, the Navajo are part of the Southern Dene peoples, and you'll see a lot of this. You'll see the Eastern Arapaho, the Western Arapaho, the Northern Shoshone, the Southern Shoshone, things like that, but this isn't quite the same thing where those two groups are typically adjacent to one another and separated by some sort of man-made boundary or something more natural like a river or a mountain range. No, the Southern Dene are separated from the Northern Dene by a couple of thousand miles, because their ancestors, their cousins up in Canada, are from the Northwest Territory. They are not anywhere near their homeland. And interestingly enough, there is a legend of the Northern Dene people that a mysterious tribe that was pretty violent, warlike, called the Naha, just up and vanished in the ancient past. Just one night they were there, the next night they were gone. Considering the sudden appearance of the Navajo in the southwest of what is now the United States, around 1300 or 1400 AD, it seems likely that this missing tribe of the Nahanni River Valley is in fact the Navajo tribe of the southwestern United States. And the interesting tie-ins and stories with other tribes don't end there, because it's said that during a war with the Ute peoples, late in the 1800s, the Navajo, who were losing, in their retreat, cursed an entire swath of land as being the path of the Skinwalker, a place where it would never be safe for non-Navajo, and really even for Navajo people, to go. This would be inhabited, this would be stalked by Skinwalkers. And of course today, Skinwalker Ranch sits on that very piece of land. Now I will say the story is dubious, I cannot find any scholarly record of it, but I find it interesting. Even if it is a story just created to make Skinwalker Ranch more interesting, I find it interesting that it was applied in this way. And at this juncture you may be asking yourself, Aiden, what is a Skinwalker? I promise, we're getting there. It's a very simple idea, and one that you're probably more familiar with than you thought. Skinwalkers are just practicing witchcraft. They are just human beings who put together some spells and rituals, and they do witchcraft. That's it. Now, what particularly that witchcraft allows them to do, that's the interesting part. because for them, they call this bad medicine. They are working with powers and beliefs and spirituality that they are not allowed to. It is taboo to be a skinwalker. It is not something that is encouraged within the Navajo culture. To become a skinwalker, you typically have to go through a number of trials. You have to speak to an elder who is also a skinwalker, and you have to go off and at some point do something that is so inhumane, so antisocial, that you, in a way, break with humanity. Now, to some people, this has been cannibalism. They've said, oh, well, to become a skinwalker, you have to commit an act of cannibalism. I don't think that that is necessarily the case. From what I can tell, there is a bit of an initiation process, there is some level of society to it, but you never have to eat somebody. That said, I have seen versions where you have to kill a family member. I've seen versions where you have to kill a close friend, something along those lines, so that there is a considerable sacrifice. You are putting being a skinwalker above everything else in your life in terms of importance, but you don't have to kill and eat someone. Once you do become a skinwalker, however, you get access to a certain set of powers. For some, these are mimicry. And it may be that the mimicry is something that you practice that's not necessarily supernatural. It could also be that this is supernaturally aided. It depends on which version of the story you're talking about and which storyteller you're talking to. Of course, the most famous of these abilities is shapeshifting, but you then have to ask the question, is shapeshifting what I think it is, as, for example, a European American, or is shapeshifting a concept that maybe the term isn't quite applying correctly? And it seems that the latter may be the case, because a lot of the Navajo that I've talked to don't believe in skinwalkers as a thing that can actually physically undergo a change into some sort of half-coyote, half-man creature, but rather you'll see somebody who stitches together the pelts of various animals and then wears it as a disguise, and the whole idea is to use it as camouflage and at the same time get the instincts and those natural abilities, those natural powers that whatever animals you're wearing had. So for a wolf, for example, you'd probably get great hearing and great senses of smell. So no actual physical transformation, more of a spiritual and mental transformation. That, however, is not to say that there are no legends that involve skinwalkers undergoing a complete physical transformation, because I have absolutely come across it. It just seems like it's not necessarily uniform across the Navajo traditions as to whether this is a full transformation like a werewolf or more of a spiritual idea. Now, according to the people I've talked to, this is something that you typically do for personal gain. It's not something that you do out of patriotism where your people are losing a war and you become a skinwalker to become a great warrior and fend them off. It's not like being a berserker. It's different. This is something that you do to enable yourself to gain wealth, to intimidate your rivals, or perhaps to get revenge on an enemy. And while it is taboo to talk about skinwalkers, I've yet to come across anything suggesting that simply saying the word skinwalker will draw them to you. And of course, I brought these up for a reason. It's because the Fleshgait does more than share a name, in a sense. The Fleshgait actually has aspects of the Skinwalker baked into it. Both have their presence characterized by the woods suddenly going silent and still, which is also something that you'll notice with other apex predators like mountain lions. Now, of course, the forest can often be silent and still. It's more about when it goes silent and still. If you're walking around and there's chattering, there's birds calling everywhere, and then suddenly it goes silent, that's a lot more intimidating than if you walked into woods that were already quiet and they just remain that way. What we're talking about here is the forest goes from being a cacophony of sounds of wildlife to dead silence. Mimicry is an essential aspect of both creatures' mythos. We're talking about calling out to you in the voice of a small child, a desperate woman, or even in the voice of someone that you know and care about. Again, it depends on how much you believe these things can get into your head. And like skinwalkers, the Fleshgait prefers forests and wildlands where interaction with humans is going to be common enough, but also nobody would notice if they went missing. Additionally, living and hunting in these regions allows them to use the natural cover that comes with woods, tall grass, things like that. But the Fleshgait and the Skinwalker don't just share strengths, they also seem to share weaknesses, as the Fleshgait is apparently supposed to be susceptible to white ash, which the common knowledge with skinwalkers is you want to dip a blade, dip a bullet, whatever you're going to be using to fight against a skinwalker in white ash. For some reason, white ashes from a fire are in some way able to break through whatever sort of magical spell they have that keeps them safe from conventional weaponry. Skinwalkers are also put off by things like sage, cedar, sandalwood, and other aromatic herbs and plants. Now, if we look at the Fleshgait and we say its core abilities, mimicry, shape-shifting, things like that, and don't forget mind reading, that those are based off of the Skinwalker, well, the appearance seems very much based off of the Wendigo. When not in human form, not in the stolen flesh, the Fleshgait is said to be tall, lanky, gray-skinned, with long clawed hands. Now, of course, I described the Wendigo earlier: tall, gaunt, emaciated, claws, apex predator, perfect hunter, mimics voices, all of those things, and of course you can see the similarities here as well. But the Wendigo, to be very clear, because a lot of people get this mixed up, the Wendigo is not capable of shapeshifting in any of the lore. There are stories that suggest that the Wendigo grows in proportion to its last meal, but that would be growth, not shapeshifting. And much like the Wendigo, the Fleshgait likes to consume its victims. It is hunting people to eat them, which again is something that a lot of people apply to skinwalkers that is not applicable. Wendigo eats people, Fleshgait eats people, Skinwalker kills people. On top of that, both the Wendigo and the Fleshgait seem to lack higher reasoning, higher intelligence, higher goals and ambitions. Their main goal really does seem to be eat person so I can survive. There are certain versions of these stories that suggest that the Wendigo has higher reasoning capabilities, like one where it kidnaps a young boy, it waits for him to get fat, and it cuts open his hand every day to see if he's growing any fatter. He then, of course, has to send the boy into a village so that the boy can get food. The boy is instructed by the Wendigo to not tell any of the villagers what's going on, that he has been kidnapped by a Wendigo. The boy, of course, tells the villagers that he has been kidnapped by a Wendigo. The villagers put together a posse, they go find the Wendigo, and they chop off his legs. They go home, they tell the boy, we found the Wendigo, we chopped off his legs, don't worry about it, not a big deal. They go out a few days later to make sure the Wendigo's dead. It's not, it's sucking the bone marrow out of its own legs, so they chop its head off and burn the body. What that story tells us is two things. One of them is that the Wendigo is not immune to normal human bladed weapons. It also tells us that the Wendigo can think, that it can do logical reasoning, so it's not quite the mindless beast that it is often depicted as, but it's also not quite as in control of its own faculties as something like the Skinwalker would be. Now, like I said earlier, you become a Wendigo by committing a heinous act, something like cannibalism, but it's not just a curse. There's more to it. You do get powers. You get superhuman strength, superhuman speed, heightened perception. Your senses are more acute. You, of course, can mimic people. And there's a few other little ones sprinkled in here and there. If you want more and more details on the Wendigo and the Skinwalker and all of that, you can check out our video on the Wendigo versus the Skinwalker. As far as curses and human identity go, the Fleshgait seems to be entirely inhuman, though certain versions of the story do suggest that it, like the Wendigo, is a cursed person. And of course, both of these are different from the Skinwalker, which is a deliberate thing that you do out of your own free will. And we get another harrowing bit of detail here, which is that the Fleshgait is apparently not harmed by fire in the same way that the Wendigo is, which is that it will immediately die, it will catch fire and go up. Fact of the matter is, Fleshgait stories often don't involve somebody fighting, they involve somebody escaping. And that may be due to its connection with our third and final thing that we want to talk about today, the Goatman. And that gets tricky because the Goatman that is associated with the Fleshgait is not quite the same Goatman that is associated with the term Goatman. The original Goatman urban legend is from Maryland, which is not really a place I often think of as having all sorts of monsters and urban legends. But the original stories, the original Goatman craze, was in the early 1970s. A bunch of dogs went missing, and a bunch of reports streamed in about the Goatman, who had been kidnapping people's dogs all the way back since the 1950s. One such case involved a German shepherd, a 10-month-old, named Ginger, who went missing and then only Ginger's head was found, about 40 yards from the train tracks. According to news reports, it had been ripped cleanly off, as if it were either a very sudden or a very violent end. Interestingly enough, an article from 1971 tells us that it doesn't explicitly say, oh, the Goatman's been around a while, but based on the quotes and the stories involved in this newspaper, what I'm sensing is that the Goatman legend had been around for a little while. It wasn't new, it wasn't something that was made up to explain 4 dogs going missing. It was something that was well known in Prince George's County, Maryland, to the extent that when newspaper reporters from Washington, D.C. came out, people knew to say, oh, it was the Goatman. And the stories seem to go back a couple of decades. And if you're sitting here saying, well, the dogs were probably just getting hit by the train, that's basically what local journalists as well as the authorities said, was these dogs are almost exclusively being found near train tracks. It's probably just dogs getting hit by trains, but the locals still felt something was amiss. They didn't feel like this was a good enough explanation. Perhaps that is why we have yet another version of the story, which involves a scientist who I guess was working with goats, and he goes crazy, he goes mad, and he goes off to live in a shack in the woods, where he will emerge at night to go and attack cars and people's animals with an axe. He was described as quite hairy, with the top half of a man and the bottom half of a goat, like I said, carrying an axe which he uses to kill people's dogs, much like the ATF. But of course, in the 1970s, this was just written off as rural people getting jumpy about old folktales. But then, at some point, 4chan got a hold of this story, and it got worse. Just like the Fleshgait, the Wendigo, and the Skinwalker, the Goatman is a mimic. It is capable of near perfectly saying and doing all of the things that a human being can. That involves shape-shifting into a human being, as well as the fact that the forest goes silent around them. You're starting to see all of these different things come together in one place, to the point where the Goatman almost feels like a proto-Fleshgait. Now, unlike the Fleshgait, which often is said to wait for somebody to leave the group, either to go to the bathroom, to make a phone call, something like that, and then pounce, the Goatman will always appear as somebody else and then infiltrate your group. But at that point, it will mess with your memory so that you start to think it's always been there. Like Fleshgaits, the Goatman also doesn't have any known weaknesses, but there is a very specific and important difference between these two creatures. The Goatman is said to be generally peaceful, though when somebody becomes suspicious of it, it will start to shake violently, to smile uncomfortably, laugh a lot, perhaps start screaming. There's a lot of things that can happen, but they all seem to be more defense mechanisms than any sort of offensive capabilities or any intention to attack. Fleshgaits, on the other hand, they're not just looking for companionship or looking to blend in, they are looking to kill. And it does it in insidious ways. It will either appear to you in the skin of a former victim, get into your head, convince you and all of your friends that you actually do know this person and there's nothing to worry about, and then pick you off one by one. Or in some cases, it will do what I said, which is wait for a member of the group to leave and then come in and steal their skin. Where Goatmen are good at mimicry, but they sometimes get things wrong, the Fleshgait is said to be perfect at it, to the point where you cannot tell that what you are talking to is not only not a human, but not your best friend from childhood. You are fully of the opinion that you have known this creature your entire life, unless you're the guy that noticed there's 6 people in a group of 5. But even that guy, the one who is typically the one in the story, who looks at it and says, we definitely only had 5 seats in the car, and there's 6 people here, that person in every story of the Fleshgait is totally incapable of figuring out which person is the wrong one. That said, they may slip up if they've only very recently changed, or so the stories go. And on top of all of that, they are masters of stealth, even in their natural form. So they don't have to be blending in to not be seen. You're just not going to know they're there until it's too late. Now, of course, as I said, the Fleshgait, just a creation of the internet. Absolutely not something that is really out there and something you need to worry about. Except for the part where it's based on 3 other folktales that might be based in reality. So like, there's no real Fleshgait, and you might think that Wendigos and Skinwalkers aren't real, but both of those things are based on something. So enjoy that little nugget of information. And just because I feel like unsettling you a little bit more and rustling your jimmies a tad bit, I would also like to bring up the fact that there is a concept it's mostly in more New Age beliefs, but there is a concept that rises out of Buddhism and Theosophy that you can create something with your mind if enough people focus on it. It's called a tulpa. You might have heard of it. The idea here is that if you get enough people to focus on one thing and to believe that it exists, it eventually will simply come into being. It will be manifested into reality. So the question kind of has to be asked, with all these people throughout the world who are thinking about Fleshgaits, or the 100 to 200,000 of you who will see this video thinking about Fleshgaits, maybe don't think about them so much. So of course the Fleshgait's not a real thing. It isn't something that you need to go out and worry about when you're off in the woods. But what it does do is speak to a lot of humanity's innate fears, the things that we are the most concerned about. And of course, what are those? We're afraid of the dark, we are afraid of being alone, we are afraid of things that look like us but aren't quite us, for reasons we don't totally still understand. The uncanny valley is not a phenomenon that has been explained. Some have suggested that it has to do with sickness. But the uncanny valley, the feeling you get when you look at a person and you just feel like that's not right, that's not the same feeling you get when you look at a sick person. Some have also suggested that the uncanny valley comes from our early encounters with Neanderthals and Denisovans. But the problem is, the more we look into that history, the more we find that it seems like human beings and Neanderthals and Denisovans all mated together. And that, maybe they weren't necessarily friends, they weren't buddies, but there was crossbreeding. And if there was crossbreeding, I find it hard to believe that the uncanny valley is a result of our genetic memory of those things. And there's also the deeper fear in here of identity. What are we fearing when we find somebody who looks like somebody we know, but we can feel that something's off? What are you actually afraid of there? Misplaced trust? Are you afraid of betrayal? Are you afraid of being lied to? Because there's really no reason to be afraid of someone who, for all you can tell, is just your friend. But if you're worried that your friend might not be your friend, for any reason, whether that is a very literal sense in that somebody is mimicking them, or the sense that you can't actually trust this person, that speaks to a much deeper psychological human fear of the world not being what we think it is, and then us having to rationalize that. So, is it likely that you're ever going to find yourself face to face with a Fleshgait off in the woods while you're on a camping trip? No, it's an internet creation. We've been over that, you silly. What are you thinking? But as a simple psychological study into what makes humans tick, what freaks us out, why are we afraid of the things that we are afraid of, it's definitely something to look into. Because with the Skinwalker, the Wendigo, the Goatman, these things that pop out of more natural folklore that is related to a specific place, those give us a glimpse. They give us a little bit, one piece of the puzzle of what humans fear, what the ultimate monster is for us. But when you have something that's created by the internet, where people take a whole bunch of different legends and throw together all the parts that they believe to be the most disconcerting, well, then you start to get a better picture of what are humans afraid of? And I think that that's pretty cool on its own. Just using folklore, using the monsters we've created to understand our own psyches and to see what is it that humans, the greatest predator of all time, the most dangerous creature to ever live that we know of, what would we be afraid of? It's just an interesting concept. But with that said, if you want to support what we're doing here at the Lore Lodge, you can subscribe to us on Patreon for just $1 a month. You can also become a member here on YouTube for $5 a month, which gets you less perks than the $1 a month one. Come on, guys, it's a simple logic. You can also buy our coffee from Tableau Roasting Company. It is Mount Pocono Perk, and it is delicious. I have a cup right here. I have been sipping it as we film. It's gotten cold. And if you want to look really cool while also repping Lore Lodge stuff, you can get our merch from thelorelodge.shop. We got mugs, we got glasses, we got canvas prints, we got stickers, but what you really want is, of course, the Wendussy Hunter t-shirt. You can also catch us having these discussions live right here on this channel at 7 p.m. on Sundays. And if you like this kind of content and you like our podcast, you like all that, but you want to see it about different topics like the Bible or history as a broad concept in general, you can also check out our channels, The Weird Bible and The History Hut. And if you want to interact with the community that we've built here, which I'm pretty proud of, to be honest, you can check out our Discord at bit.ly/jointhelodge. Once again, I am Aiden Mattis, and thank you for stopping by the Lore Lodge.